and welcome to the Open Banking and Rise of FinTech session. I'm really happy to be here at the Open Banking Week, which is a global event where ecosystem players come together with the objective to change literacy and progress of the world towards the future of open finance. I am Elena Litani, FinTech and Product and Technology Executive, and I will be moderating a truly global panel. We will have an opportunity to discuss what's the state of open banking in Canada, US, Europe, UK, and other jurisdictions. We'll talk about lessons learned, what the future holds in each jurisdictions, and what benefits and more importantly, use cases open finance brings to consumers, businesses, and economic ecosystem as a whole. I would love to start with the introductions of our esteemed panelists. So Michelle, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Very excited to be here. My name is Michelle Bayo. I'm the CEO and founder of Finnovator, which is a fintech consultancy largely focused on North America payment innovation. And I'm quite passionate about open banking. My background is 6 years in telco, 8 years in online shopping, affiliate marketing. I ran Alaska, Lufthansa, Delta, and United online shopping mall platforms, jumped into the prepaid space, got to see the underserved and what prepaid can do for that ecosystem and what fintechs were also doing for the market. Got quite passionate and actually joined the Open Banking Initiative of Canada as a board member in August, which is a non-for-profit organization largely trying to help open banking drive forward in Canada. So very excited to be here today.
Thank you, Michelle. Very excited to have you here. Lisa.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here as well. I'm head of business at Saltage, and I've been spending my probably last 6 years in the open banking initiatives, starting in Europe and even before it was implemented. And at Saltage, we've been helping more than 200 businesses to either build up the APIs to meet open banking requirements or to have access to an open banking gateway that has connected over 5,000 banks in 50 countries as a unified global open banking standard.
Wow, this is pretty impressive, Lisa. Steve.
Thanks, Elena. I'm Steve Baums. I lead the Financial Data and Technology Association's North American chapter. We're a trade association that represents about 36 fintechs, data aggregators, and other organizations that are all united behind open finance, one of which is Saltage. And we are also a chapter of a global organization. So FData Global has chapters on virtually every continent across the world, except for Antarctica at the moment. And it's a really great forum for us to take lessons learned from markets that have frankly moved much faster than North America, and inform policymakers about best outcomes, best in class decision-making, also things that if they were done over again, governments and policymakers might do a bit differently. So delighted to be here.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to have you here. So why don't we start with, state of different open banking in different jurisdictions. Lisa, I think you are actually working in jurisdictions which are more advanced and you're actually implementing it and seeing it. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah, of course. I probably started with Europe because it started the earliest. So the initiative was aiming to launch in September 2019, but even today, it's not really ready. So it was postponed due to bank unreadiness multiple times. And there are only a few countries in Europe that actually make it work. And we are talking about UK really, and perhaps Netherlands, Germany, and Spain that are kicking in a bit later on. But there are still so many errors and mistakes that banks haven't implemented because there were just a lot of standards and a lot of options they could aim for. So right now in Europe, we have roughly over 200 third parties that are trying to innovate and build up the new use cases around the open banking or trying to improve their user experiences in the current products. And the majority of them are still, unfortunately, in the pilot stage. So we're not seeing a huge, massive adoptions just because of the bank unreadiness. That's the current state in Europe. I do hope that by the next year, we'll already see quite a lot of live APIs and products that are being using the open banking. However, it's not the case today. In other parts of the world, like for example, in APAC region, we can tell probably about Australia, which is leading the open banking from a bit different perspective. It's a part of their consumer data rights. And it's very interesting to see that despite only the banking sector, they also included energy and telecom sectors that are coming next. So this is quite impressive, I'd say, as well. And we're really looking forward to what will happen there. We're kind of trying to keep an eye in the region. In Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, they have also rolled out initiatives, but unlike the other jurisdictions, they did it based on the bilateral agreements. And I can tell today that the fintechs that we are working with cannot really use it because it's nearly impossible to sign agreements with a single bank. So this is some of the insights I can share with the audience today. So hopefully Steve and Michelle can add up from other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I would love to hear from Michelle because I would love you to bring some of the Canadian perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely been a part of a lot of discussions, and I believe open banking has been a great discussion for many of years, probably since 2018. But unfortunately, currently we're definitely, I will take a word out of an article, a glacier pace in Canada. We're definitely not being fast followers at the moment. We're looking into other markets, but unfortunately the pace is just not being swift. So some highlights, there's been movement. So I will share that there was a Senate paper that very much was focused on the need for open banking within Canada. There was 2 consultations, the second happening after we got our new Minister of Finance, and that happened in November and December. And it was great to have everybody at the table. And I think there was some good wins from gathering and going through a lot of discussion. There was definitely fintechs and banks and VCs within the discussion. I think the challenge is you could see the 2 camps, the fintech camp and the bank camp, and largely the entire 5 sessions where we're talking about the challenges for both of these parties instead of the consumer or the small business having a voice on how this is going to help them. And the purpose of why open banking is driving so much for UK consumers and data rights. So I think another good piece is that Bill C11 was created and presented in November. Unfortunately, it just hasn't made any movement. And this Bill C11 is actually our consumer data rights for Canada. So it's just a little concerning that it has not got the momentum to bring Canadians the right to have their data, similar to what's happened in Australia and the UK, Brazil, Mexico, and around the world, thanks to Lisa's comments. And Steve, I'm sure, has so much to add.
Yeah, so Steve, maybe to add a bit, maybe you can add a bit more to what maybe Michelle was pointing out, or Lisa, and maybe also bring some US or other jurisdiction perspective.
Happy to. So Michelle, I think you were being incredibly kind when you described the progress as glacial. I'll be, as is my personality, I'll be more direct, which is to say that North America generally has been a complete laggard as compared to many, many other areas of the world. So Michelle obviously covered the Canadian market very well. Let me move a little bit south and just talk a little bit about the US before I talk a little bit more about some other markets. The US, like Canada, has not had, until very recently, any kind of government intervention in this question of what the consumer or SME utility over their own financial data is. Now, the difference between the US and Canada is that there is significantly more wide-scale adoption of fintech tools in the US, even without that kind of assurance. So just across FData members, we have between 100 and 110 million consumer accounts or SME accounts, which is a pretty significant proportion of the population. But there is no legal requirement that a financial institution make any data available to a third party at the consumer or SME's direction in the US. And so if you follow this space like I do, you'll see every couple of weeks there will be an article in a newspaper about a blockage or a use case that a consumer can't use. or a financial institution that is telling the consumer, we don't support X, Y, Z fintech, use ABC fintech instead. And it turns out that ABC fintech is a fintech that bank has an investment in or has some type of ownership stake in. So it is very much a commercially driven ecosystem in the US at the moment. I'd point to a parallel that Lisa raised with bilateral agreements in other markets. The US at the moment is entirely driven by bilateral data access agreements, which works pretty well for the largest, say 15 or 20 financial institutions, and is a real headache for virtually everybody else in the market, fintechs, data aggregators, and the other 10,000 financial institutions in the US. That said, there is also reason for optimism in the US because the US Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is the regulator that's tasked with oversight of this market, announced late last year its intention to move forward with a regulation that would bring open finance into force. So we're expecting progress on that this year. The other market in North America, the Mexican market, is the most advanced market on the continent. Mexico passed the fintech law several years ago. That law requires open finance API standards. Implementation of that law has been significantly delayed as a result of a number of things, political turnover, obviously COVID and the impact that COVID has had on both financial and political developments. But we are anticipating a continued slow but steady pace towards deployment in Mexico over the next several years. The other market that I would flag in South America as a real mover in this hemisphere is Brazil. The Central Bank of Brazil has signaled its intention to move forward with open finance. We will see the implementation of open finance in Brazil in 4 phases this year, ending in December of this year. And so there is real cause for celebration of Brazil's movement. And our hope is that that becomes a bellwether in the South American market as other countries look to Brazil's experience to bring open finance into force on their own.
No, thank you, Steve. This is a really great overview, and quite unfortunate to see lack of progress, of course, in Canada and US, and very optimistic timeline in Brazil. So hopefully they will be successful in delivering that fast. So some of you already touched on the point of lessons learned, like, for example, bilateral agreements seem not to be working, lack of standardization causing issues. But maybe we can dive in a bit more deeper in this space and talk a bit of what you've observed and what works potentially or what doesn't. So Steve, maybe starting again with you. And
sure. So I've got a long list, Elena, but I'll try to be quick. So I'll hit maybe the key points. First lesson learned is commercially driven open finance is not open finance, right? And if you leave it to industry on its own to figure this out, the control and influence that the larger players have will ultimately find its way into how open finance is or is not delivered in the market. The only method that's worked in markets where we have true open finance is when government has declared a consumer and SME data right and provided the policy standards by which that data right will be provided. So that's the first lesson. Lesson 2 is that APIs do not equal open finance. APIs are the highway through which open finance is delivered, but the mere existence of APIs does not mean that you have an open finance marketplace. The third lesson is there has to be some type of supervisory oversight over the third parties that are delivering these services to consumers and SMEs, both from a consumer and SME protection perspective, but also from a liability perspective. The rules that overwhelmingly most countries have in place for consumer and SME restitution assumes that the only entities that would ever interact with that consumer's finances are banks or financial institutions. And so those have to be modernized when you think about third parties having the same level or some level of interaction with consumer finance. And the fourth and the last thing that I would say, and we can get into a conversation about this if it's of interest, is there is a lot of hand-wringing in jurisdictions that are considering open finance around what degree of consumer and SME education there should be around what open finance is, how it works. In other words, what does the end user have to understand about the open finance regime? And I think the key takeaway from other markets is it's not the inner mechanics of open finance. Open finance is not the product. It's the platform upon which the product is delivered. It's really two things. One is trust. The consumer has to understand they can trust the system. And two is the idea that if something goes wrong, they know who to turn to be made whole. So Elena, those were maybe my top 3 or 4, and I will leave it there, but a fascinating area that I'm sure we can have a much longer conversation about.
Yeah, it seems like we can debate and discuss that for probably at least an hour, each single point. So, but Michelle, maybe you can add a bit more perspective. I know Canada is not really advanced in the space. However, Steve brought some interesting points about education, and I know you spoke previously about security. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of open banking, and maybe some of the reason why we're so slow, is Canadians are conservative. So they think by waiting, it's less of a risk. But I think we've all come to the mind, anybody who's close to open banking, that actually not moving forward is the biggest risk, because it is a global arms race to open banking, open finance, and it's empowering other fintechs in different jurisdictions to have all of the global funding. To give an example, in the UK, they hit $6 billion in 2019 in investment in their fintechs to Canada's 241 million. There's enough room to say that if we had the infrastructure, the data rights, to Steve's point, the regulation and the mandate, because the UK has had a mass global advantage. Yeah, they've had definitely hiccups and lessons learned, but mandating the 9 banks to move to open finance has driven an ecosystem that is not a zero-sum game. It is an opportunity for growth, for small businesses to save money, for UK consumers to also save money and understand their finance. And it feels odd that Canada has let screen scraping go to the point that they have, because in the UK, when it hit 1 million UK citizens using screen scraping, they got concerned about the data rights and who had this data, and moved specifically to open finance to protect consumer data rights. And in Canada, we seem complacent with the fact that 4+ million, maybe 6 million at this point, because the data was from 2019, are currently wanting to use Wealthsimple, Coho, EQ Bank, Wave, and great Canadian startups. But unfortunately, the only way for them to do that is by clicking a button that gives away their password and doesn't allow them to revoke it. So I think the other misnomer is the fact that it's more secure to have our broken style open banking with screen scraping today than it would be to move to a regulated, government mandated open finance infrastructure that would give uptimes of clean APIs of 99.9%, so that consumers, like small businesses, wouldn't lose access to their accounting infrastructure because they happen to be connecting to it from their core bank through screen scraping. And I think that the lesson I would like to have known is that the time is now. Or I don't know where Canadian finance will be in 5 to 10 years when we do make the move, because Brazil and Mexico and Singapore and Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the UAE are all running forward at full pace, and we are still talking.
Thank you, Michelle. Lisa, I would love to hear more implementation hands-on perspective. So can you give us some of your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. I mean, besides what Steve and Michelle had brought up, I think that also it's very important to have some kind of entity that will help out with the testing of the APIs. So for instance, like OBA in the UK, because in other jurisdictions which did not have any API performance testing or anything like it, we still have a lot of issues that we have to report to the banks that do really nothing about it, or they solve the issues in like 3 to 6 months time, or don't even reply to TPPs unless you go to regulators. So this is one of the few things that are really a pain for all the TPPs that are trying to connect to APIs. The second one being user guides that are really clear to everybody, to the banks, to the fintechs, how it should work, how it should be implemented, because then it really helps to improve the user journey. As you know, the poor user journey and unclearance, because it's something new for the customers, means slow user adoption. So that would be the second point. The third one, probably for the regulators, is do not have too optimistic deadlines, and try to make let's say, getting the license by TPPs a bit easier. Because in some jurisdictions, for instance, in Australia now, to get let's say to be licensed in Australia would mean that you kind of need to spend roughly 1 million. So it's a lot. It's impossible. You have to really get funding just to get the recipient license. So this is something a bit crazy, and this is something that should be also taken into account in the jurisdictions that are trying to adopt open banking. And of course, look road to the market different implementations. Always include on payment accounts. It's a nightmare now in Europe because of it, and it still has to rely on screen scraping because of it. And ideally, if possible, move not only into open banking world, but into open finance and open data, adding up other sectors to the regulatory requirements.
These are the great points, Lisa. Anything to add, Steve, Michelle, before we move forward?
There's one thing that came to mind as I was listening to Michelle and Lisa talk, and it's not directly in response to what they've said, but I'll throw it out there. Maybe it's a discussion point. So in many markets that have moved to open finance, and some that haven't, including Canada, one of the concerns that I hear raised a lot is open finance means that big tech is going to come in and eat everybody's lunch and basically, monopolize the finance market. And I would say a few things about that. So first, that hasn't happened in any of the markets where we have open finance today. The margins in financial services are nowhere near what the margins are for the core business of those big tech companies. But second, and maybe this is a bit controversial, I would argue that if there is a level regulatory playing field for data recipients, data holders in the open finance environment, and let's say Facebook or Amazon decides to come into an open finance regime and offer some type of financial services product as a third party, and they have to play by the same rules that any other third party does, then they should be able to. And that might be a popular opinion, but if the playing field is level, then the consumer and the SME should have full choice over which third party to use, be that Facebook or some small fintech that started in a garage somewhere. The key point, though, is without the policy standards, without the implementation entity, without the regulations in place, today there is much less friction for a large big tech company to come in and provide some type of fintech solution. So I guess it goes back to something that Michelle was kind of referencing earlier, which is in many ways, the status quo actually provides significantly less protection and assurance to consumers and SMEs and to the entire system than a well-designed open finance regime would.
I couldn't agree more, Steve. Thank you for bringing it up. It's definitely one of those points which scares a lot of people talking about big tech and their capabilities. But you're absolutely right to bringing those, highlights and opinions. So thank you. So we do have a couple of minutes left. So I was wondering, maybe again, we've spoken a lot about where we stand today, what are the lessons learned, but maybe circling back. Why is it so important? Why we keep talking about open finance? What kind of benefits it drives to consumers, to businesses, or does it, right? So I was wondering, maybe some of you can speak to those points and maybe bring some fintechs as a highlights or use cases that you think would be applicable. Michelle, why would we, go first?
Yeah, I'm really happy that I host this series on it for OBIC alongside Independent Senator Deakin, because we've done 10 episodes and we've tried to make every one of the episodes kind of an education point on open banking. And we just did one with the OBIE and Payments Canada talking about B2B and talking about government benefits of open banking. We've talked a lot about consumer benefits, and I think that's the simplistic one that's being utilized. Consumers can understand their finance better, can have a better overarching view of where everything lives and save money on a long-term play, which is extremely important. But I think the piece we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is this small to medium-sized business advantages as well as government. So just to speak to that, in the UK, 99% of all private sector is small to medium businesses. And in Canada, it's 97%. So it's a mass part of our ecosystem. And when you add layered in services from open finance and open banking, what you get is an easier way to get late payments taken care of for your invoices, which can save companies. 50,000 companies go under in the UK every year just because they can't, they're getting a late payment for their invoice. But if you have open banking infrastructure, they can get requests to pay, they can have better visibility on their finances, and they can get better access to loans, where before open finance, it's very hard for small businesses to get loans because there's just not enough data to give them access to such things. And I think it's going to change the landscape. It already has in the UK, and it can definitely help Canada start to recover from COVID faster if we had some of this infrastructure in the near future versus the far future, as well as tax payments. When the gentleman, Simon Lyons from OBIE, was talking about how they've just started to implement tax payments through open banking in the UK, he wasn't able to share the numbers, but that they believed that it was something like 5x what they had thought they would bring in, because there was less lost tax payments, and it was just easier to reconcile. So the government has made more money from having open finance. And I think it's an important topic for us to talk about to help maybe speed this up in the UK or in Canada and the US.
Thank you, Michelle. Agree. Businesses we talk less about, and it's great to have that perspective. Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, I'll probably start with the user perspective, because at the end of the day, open banking, it's all about the users. I think that the first thing that I'm really excited about is that myself as a customer, I earn control over my financial world, because I can choose the application I want to use for my daily finance. Because I can always, let's say, take care of my consents and which data has been shared with whom, because right now I don't have this possibility. And most importantly, all of that is happening in a secure environment, because as Michelle mentioned, everyone is still using screen scraping. And in Europe, it's not only for the aggregation of the data, but also for payments. And because when you're sharing your credentials, you never know what might happen. And because of that, I think that having it in a secure way, knowing that the application you're going to use is also regulated fintech, is really helping out to build trust in the sector. And of course, I'm an expat still in London, living here for just a couple of years. And I know I had a huge struggle with just renting an apartment here because I didn't have any history. And now, for example, we work with several companies in the UK and even globally that are helping out for the expat community to get their first apartment, or even have some kind of credit history based on their other country financial records. So this is something that can allow you to really improve it that we haven't had before. And probably the other use cases whereabouts probably all of us had issues when trying to purchase some tickets, or to have some international merchants acquisitions for our own benefits. Sometimes our cards did not work. So here open banking can again play a really good option as where you can pay by bank directly rather than using the cards, which will not always pass. So these are just some of the benefits I wanted to highlight for the users.
Thank you, Lisa. Very unique and interesting examples to bring up. Thank you. Steve.
I think Lisa hit a bit on where I was going to go, which is I get very passionate about the freer and fairer financial access promise of open finance. So the what in the US is called a credit invisible, or the thin file credit applicant, the recent immigrant to the US or to an open finance regime, who can use their cash flow data from their financial transactions from their country of origin as a way to build credit. There are live examples of that in the US, but not yet at scale in Canada. The SME financial access argument. So it's not just the number of SMEs, but it's also the heart and soul of the SME economy is, generally speaking, the very smallest SMEs, the sole proprietor, or maybe it's two people. And what the pandemic has showed us is that it has been incredibly challenging for the smallest of the SMEs to access credit affordably and dependably when they needed it the most. Unfortunately, in Canada, there was no fintech participation in any of the various programs that were extended out to SMEs. But that was not the case in virtually every other market in which FData participates. And what we saw, and there's academic data, so this is not from us, this is from folks who studied it, is the data that fintechs facilitate, or the credit that fintechs facilitated, the assistance that fintechs facilitated for SMEs, predominantly went to two types. One, the very smallest, and two, minority and women-owned SMEs, at rates that were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9x what traditional financial institutions were extending to those same SMEs. So I am very bullish around the potential for open finance, not just to bring kind of macroeconomic benefits, as Michelle laid out before, and 100% agree with that, but on the individual growth, expansion, transparency, competitive, fairer, freer financial access argument, I think that to me is the best promise of a true open finance regime.
Wow, this is a great point to end the discussion. This is so I think, optimistic to look at the potential. I did wanted to quickly highlight, I think we learned today that market-driven approach doesn't really work. APIs are not equal to open finance. I love that point from Steve. I think open finance approves security. Thank you, Michelle, for that. And it's not a product. I think it's a platform. I think it's a great reminder to all of us. This is a platform upon which many fantastic products will be built for consumers and businesses. And it will enable potentially truly open cross-border finance for everyone. So I think everyone benefits, and it's I hope that all of us will continue pushing it forward, and jurisdictions will enable it soon. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your contribution today. So thank you.
Thank you, Elena.